My name is Marcy Berger, and I'm the Member Services Coordinator here at AFSA. Welcome to Virtual Auto Retailing in Today's Marketplace, Outlook and Digital Strategies for Lenders, presented by Jonathan Smoke and Andy Mayers. This presentation is a part of AFSA's Business Partner Webinar Series, which allows industry experts to share timely educational topics directly with AFSA members. The webinars are designed to provide information that will allow AFSA members to more effectively design, develop, and implement strategies for their company's success. For more information about how to become a presenter, feel free to reach out to me following today's webinar. A few housekeeping notes. To ask a question, use the question box on the side of your screen. I'll read them aloud to all following the presentation. The slides and recording of today's webinar will be available later today on AFSA's website in the Webinar Resource Center. Finally, you'll receive a survey after the webinar is over. Please take a moment to complete it. Your responses help us fine-tune the program so we can target the issues that are important to you. A bit about our presenters. Jonathan Smokes serves as the Vice President and Chief Economist leading Cox Automotive Economic Industry Insights team, which leverages data to expand Cox Automotive's deep expertise in all aspects of the automotive industry. The Industry Insights team tracks new and used vehicle sales, supply, prices, retail and fleet demand, consumer credit, and the auto financing and dealer sentiment to understand the key trends impacting both the wholesale and retailers and retail markets for vehicles informed by the data of all companies, businesses, and platforms, including Auto Trader, Kelley Blue Book, and Dealertrack. Smoke holds a bachelor's degree in economics and religious studies from Rhodes College and a master's degree in business from the University of Austin. On to our next presenter. As Dealertrack F&I Lending Solutions Strategist, Andy Mayers spearheads enterprise product strategy for lending partners across Cox Automotive. Mayers works with various Cox Automotive businesses to identify product opportunities that will deliver enhanced value for lending partners, and he also serves as the voice of the lender when new innovations are proposed and circulated for consideration to Cox Automotive. With expertise stemming from 20 years of experience in providing software to dealers and financial institutions during his 17-year tenure at Dealertrack, Mayer's oversight has included leading the product management team, product managing e-contracting, developed Dealertrack's overall integration strategy, and managing the business analyst and UX teams. Mayers holds a Master's of Instructional Design from Towson University. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Andy and Jonathan.
Thanks, Marcy. This is Jonathan Smoke. I'm starting off. Collectively, we're going to be giving you, in essence, an auto retailing State of the Union, because I'll be covering macro and what we're seeing in the most latest data in terms of the economy and the finance and auto market specifically, and then we'll delve into consumer and dealer insights that we're seeing in this new business landscape, and that's where my pal Andy will be sharing more details, and we'll come together at the end to also take some Q&A. So let me start by talking about the macro scenario and, of course, addressing what is really causing this downturn we're experiencing is COVID-19 and the pandemic that we've been going through. The reality is, though, the U.S. isn't actually experiencing a pandemic. We're experiencing hundreds of pandemics that are playing out differently at a local level. This heat map is showing you the data as of the beginning of this week for the number of cases in the U.S. relative to the population by county. And what you see is 8% of the counties are blank. They have no reported cases. The largest markets like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles definitely have volumes that drive some activity. But the hot spots are a mix of some of those large volumes, but also places that, especially over the last several weeks, have represented more rural areas of the country that tended to have one of two features, and that is large local prisons or meat packing plants that have really been the source of a lot of the more recent outbreaks. Our attention with our data science team is really looking at trends in the pandemic at a local level and assessing which areas are quickly turning to lower risk and therefore opening up and likely to see more economic and auto sale activity, and which markets unfortunately are not improving or potentially are moving in the wrong direction. That's the reality that we'll be living with for some time. But I'm happy to share with you from an auto sales perspective right at the gate that we've been seeing incredible recovery in vehicle sales at a local market level. The heat map that I'm showing on this slide is a heat map that we're using credit applications, unique credit applications on Dealertrack, and we're comparing what happened last week in total unique applications relative to the same week in 2019. If you've been following any of the videos that I've been doing weekly now for 9 weeks, I've basically been able to track this market level activity now for the last 5 or so. And the first map I did had a lot of red on it, and that was because we classified markets by how much they were off relative to the same activity in the prior year. Our threshold for the red was down 60% year over year. And the reason why there's no red on this week's map is because there was no market in the country that was down more than 50% last week. So none met our criteria for being severely impacted. Instead, we have a lot of green and some yellow. The green markets are the markets that we call unaffected. They were down approximately, collectively on average, 3%. They were actually up, sorry, not down, collectively 3% last week compared to last year, which is just astounding. And then the remaining yellow markets, there are 51 of them, collectively were down by 23%. The map is getting greener. Just last week, we had 37 markets move from the color yellow to the color green. And in fact, when I first did this map 5 weeks ago, there were only 5 green markets, and now we have 156. And we were 1 market shy from being able to say that half the markets in the country actually saw more credit applications last week compared to the same week in 2019. And given the momentum I'm seeing already this week, I think we're heading in that direction. So now moving to what we see in the economy, let's talk specifically about the impact to the job market, because that's what's most front and center with everyone. We've had a total of 33.4 million jobless claims or filings for unemployment insurance over the last 7 weeks. And that represents 21% of the jobs that we had in February. Officially, the unemployment rate that was reported last week for April is 14.7%, but May is likely to be higher, potentially as high as 20%, which was only surpassed by the unemployment level back in the Great Depression. When we assess the impact, though, by state, we also see quite a bit of variation. We measure each state jobless claims relative to their jobs in February. We see the darkest states as the most impacted on this map. Specifically, the most impacted through the latest data are Kentucky, Georgia, Hawaii, Rhode Island, and Michigan. And basically what we see relative to the most impacted versus the least is the most impacted tend to have high concentrations of travel and tourism jobs, manufacturing, and a heavy concentration of service industries, which have been the hardest hit overall. And as we assess the impact to the consumer from that, consumer sentiment is normally a very valuable indicator, because consumer sentiment is normally inversely correlated to the unemployment rate, meaning when unemployment is going up, we see consumer sentiment come down and vice versa. But it's also, consumer sentiment is also a great predictor of the vehicle market. We've been following the index of consumer sentiment from Morning Consult, because they basically have built the ability to look at consumer sentiment on a daily basis, as opposed to the monthly reading that we get from the traditional University of Michigan study. What we've seen in that data is that we hit bottom in consumer sentiment on April 7th, and we've been seeing essentially a movement slightly up and slightly down each week. Some progress. We were down at the worst point, 29%. We're now down only 25%. But basically, I'm not optimistic that we're going to clearly see that moving in a more positive direction until we get more consistent news on both the pandemic and the U.S. Economy. Now, turning to the financial aspect of auto lending, we came into this year worried about the subprime consumer in particular being fairly fragile. We had been seeing record severe delinquency rates for subprime at the end of last year and into January of this year. The good news was that the severe delinquency rate declined in both February and March. However, that needs a big caveat because as you can see on this chart, which is showing you subprime, that's the green line, and then the market overall in blue, there is extreme seasonality that usually exists in delinquencies. And that's because households get ahead of themselves in spending in the holiday season and the very beginning of the year as bills come due, and then usually catch up when tax refunds are received in the months of February, March, and April. And indeed, we saw declines in February and March, but as you can see from the chart, they weren't the normal declines. Usually, March ends up being the low point for the year in delinquency rate, and yet the way that we've left March is actually the highest delinquency rate since the Great Recession. So consumers are definitely fragile. We think that directly relates to some of the tightening behavior you can see in lending that was already existing even before we got into the pandemic. And that rate relates directly to seeing also some trends that we've observed in interest rates. As you all know, the Fed aggressively moved to cutting the rates that they control to zero in their March meeting. And initially, we did not see consumer rates respond accordingly. In fact, in the month of March, we saw higher auto loan rates in general, and we also saw mortgage rates come up quite a bit. And they were really reflecting the trend that was happening in the bond market and specifically in longer treasuries like the 10-year. In April, we did see consumer rates come down. We saw them come down on mortgage rates almost to new lows and certainly more attractive than they were in March, but even lower than they were in February. And auto loans, we've also started to see them come down, but mainly the decline that we've seen in the new vehicle market has been going to the best credit tiers. The highest credit tiers are the ones who are the beneficiaries of being able to get zero APR deals that have been offered since the end of March by many of the manufacturers, and I'll end with some data on that front. And then as we move into actual vehicle sales, we've been producing an estimate, a daily view of what new and used retail sales look like. We're using Dealertrack data, but we're producing what we call a same-store methodology. And so we're pulling credit applications that have turned into sales as well as contracting from e-contracting. And we're looking at a consistent basis of stores around the country that gives us the right mix of geography and brands. And what we see in that data is that new sales were strong at the beginning of March, but then very rapidly declined at the worst point, being down a bit more than 70% on a year-over-year basis before bottoming out on the new side at the end of March. And then we've been seeing really fairly consistent recovery and improvement almost day to day, but certainly week to week since. Last week saw actually an additional acceleration in recovery, and that was correlated with most areas of the country now allowing showrooms to be open again. So we estimate that new sales were only down 37% year over year last week. In the used side of sales, we're seeing a very similar trend, although the used market has had some periods of quickening recovery and then declines. In particular, the used market, we think, bottomed at the very beginning of April, saw some accelerating recovery in the third week of April before giving up a little ground at month end. As often is the case, used retail sales from franchise dealers take a back seat when they're trying to close new vehicle sales. But then as the month ended and transitioned into May, we've really seen the used market particularly accelerate again. We estimate the used market was only down 15% year over year last week. It improved again on Sunday, which is what's illustrated here, and actually it has improved so far this week and for the days that we've been able to review the data. And as you might guess, as we've seen declines in used retail sales in the early stages of this, we saw massive declines in wholesale transactions. Manheim, for about 4 weeks in a row, saw transactions down nearly 80% on a year-over-year basis. But over the last several weeks, we've been seeing transactions increase, and that amount of decline year-over-year has come down pretty dramatically. Last week, wholesale transactions at Manheim were down only 33%, and this week has continued the momentum that I'm positive we'll see an even better number this week. With that improving demand, we are moving from a time frame where wholesale used vehicle values were down more than 10%, at their worst point down 12%, to stabilizing to actually improving over the last week. For example, I'm charting here what 2017 model year prices have done over the last 2 years indexed to the beginning of the year. That yellow line is showing you that in tax refund season, pricing typically goes up, and we were seeing that this year, but this year it transitioned from a peak of the year to the pandemic. So we very quickly went from prices being up to prices falling by, at its worst point, 12% from the peak. Last week, though, saw pricing in the wholesale market turn around and improve almost 1%. So we estimate that wholesale prices are now down 10% from the peak in week 11. But it's quite a contrast to the blue line, which is measuring retail prices for the same model year. And retail prices actually continued to go up in the early weeks of the pandemic and have only been coming down modestly over the last 5 weeks. We estimate that retail prices are down only 2.3% since the peak of the market back in week 11. So there's quite a gap that actually is encouraging dealers to buy used inventory, especially as they start to see the market recover. And we do think that that means April was the low point in used vehicle values. And then, as I mentioned earlier, certainly one of the pieces of catalysts, if you will, that have been driving the new vehicle recovery has been the aggressive offers that consumers have been seeing from most manufacturers that offer 0% APRs, but also offer payment deferrals for several months and some of the longest terms we've ever seen offered in the United States. That share of 0% deals was only 2.4% in February, 6.6% in March, jumped all the way to 21.4% in April, and so far in May has come down modestly to 18% as a reflection of actually some of those deals being somewhat curtailed. And then finally, I can share with you some good data points that suggest we're not done with this recovery. In fact, all of our leading indicators from Cox Automotive platforms are suggesting that these trends are going to continue. So through Saturday, we've been seeing strong traffic growth on AutoTrader ever since essentially 2 weeks into the pandemic. But it's been strengthening. Through Saturday, leads on AutoTrader were up 35%. Leads on Kelley Blue Book, which is much more new vehicle sales, were up 33% year over year. Dealer.com, which manages thousands of dealer websites, have been seeing new and used vehicle form submissions outperform what would normally be the case. And so new vehicle form submissions were up 79% this past week. And then this number is negative, and it may sound negative to say credit applications are down 11% on a same-store basis, but when they were down more than 70% several weeks ago, 11% down sounds a heck of a lot better. And the trend so far this week suggests we'll be in the single digits for next week. And then finally, the service department has actually seen declines that in many cases for dealers has been more severe than what they've seen in their sales department. But we've been seeing that steadily come down too, and while it's still a negative number, down 30% year over year, that's a heck of a lot better than being down more than 60% just a few weeks ago. So that's the view of the macro and the key trends we're seeing. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague and partner in crime for this, Andy Mayers.
Thanks, Jonathan. Move my slide here. So I just wanted to share, first of all, I hope everybody's doing well and staying safe. This has been a very different and interesting time for all of us in the auto finance industry, as we all know. You know, in the last couple of weeks, last 6 weeks, you know, 7, 8 weeks ago, we were all focused on just keeping our businesses operating, running without disruptions, and we continue to do that as an industry. But I think what we're really starting to see in working with our lending partners, working with our dealer partners and consumers, is we're starting to see the rapid emergence of how cars are going to be sold. And that major shift is, you know, I think been accelerated. You know, we've always talked about digital retailing and you know, customers buying cars at home, but that's been accelerated rapidly. Everything we see on TV right now, hopefully you're watching less TV like I am, but everything we do see is all about automation, touchless, contactless. Every OEM ad is home delivery, no contact, all articulating ways to do cars. All our conversations we've had with our OEM and captive partners have been, how can I deliver vehicles to my consumers at home and, you know, address this new thing called social distancing. So what I want to share with you now is I want to share some data we've collected and share some behaviors and trends that we've seen. You know, Jonathan mentioned how the volume is starting to come back, which I think you guys are starting to see that. We're starting to see, you know, hopefully the benefits of some of the stimulus payments getting in the hands of customers, and they're starting to use that to be able to purchase cars. But as I mentioned, we're really starting to see at-home services as a way to do this. And some of the data I'm going to share with you will explain to you why and what the consumers are thinking about online transactions. So let's just talk about some consumer data. Now, as Jonathan mentioned, we are constantly surveying our customers. Cox is doing weekly surveys of consumers every week since this has emerged. And the purpose of those is to understand how consumers are and what their perspectives about car buying sentiments are. You know, back in early March, you know, only 7% of the people plan to you know, purchase or buy a car. That has grown. It grew up to about 35% in March. It's kind of leveled off at 31%. I think some of the economic impacts are starting to take a little effect there. But ultimately, what's happening is we still have a consumer that's out there that wants to buy cars. And, you know, they're still looking to buy cars. Now, on the next slide, what you'll see is their intent to buy cars and when they wanted to buy cars. So once again, during the behavioral research that we've done, if you kind of look back to early March, right, 32% of the people were not sure that they'd even want to be buying a car. They had no idea when they were going to buy a car. And, you know, 5% were about 6 months. You know, 32% were, you know, 3 to 6 months, and 36% was up to 2 months. So I think some of the things that are important to pull out here, first of all, is the trends, as you can see, is when people, you know, not sure, has gone down significantly. I think it's come back a little bit based on, you know, some consumer concerns about, you know, furloughs and things like that. But essentially, we're still at a higher percentage of people that want to, you know, are no longer uncomfortable about when they're going to be buying a car. And then the other thing is the car buying process has gone from 30%. It's still at 37% in up to 2 months. So it's, you know, 2/3 of the customers are still actively shopping. They're looking for ways to purchase without having to visit a dealership. In some cases, back in March, they had to do that because dealerships weren't open. But in, you know, as dealerships are opening, consumers and dealers are still trying to figure out how to move to digital retailing. I think this is an important thing for us as a auto finance community to make sure we're prepared to understand how we're supporting our customers in that you know, opportunity. Jonathan mentioned that Dealer.com's volume is up significantly. Let's just talk a little bit about what shoppers are saying about, you know, online buying. In this next slide, 2 out of 3 shoppers were most likely to buy a vehicle 100% online. 100%. Now, as an industry, we have some challenges with that because there's still some paper in the process that cannot be e-signed. But ultimately, a consumer is looking to do the entire process online. 88% of our dealers have gone, to figure out ways to deliver vehicles outside their physical location. And that actually spans to a couple different parts. That actually deals with dealers who are actually having customers to integrate with them through digital retailing, but also they're looking for different facilities and methodologies to communicate with the consumers. A lot of our dealers have people working from home. A lot of people are still managing the sales transactions remotely. Slowly, as stores or retail stores are opening up, the dealers have access to do that. But as you all know, the way that they can integrate with the customers is much more complex now. You can't have walk-in traffic, so you have to schedule an appointment. Someone needs to be scheduled. They're scheduled 30 minutes apart. So it's really changing the way the retailing experience is working. And then you can see in the value, 80% of our franchise dealers now have a solution in place. And going back to April, that was only 64%. So think about what dealers are doing. They're adapting. We know the dealers are very adaptive and innovative. They're seeing digital retailing as a way to do this. Our OEM partners, our captives, they're all seeing the same thing. They need to make sure they have access to communicate with their customers. I do think it's important for us to think about that because as a lending and financing community, we also need to think about how we're there to support that. Accepting online credit applications on behalf of your dealer network, ensuring that you have the right compliance and efficiencies in place to support these, making sure that you have a way to manage how your customer, your consumer, and your dealer customers are, facilitating remote deliveries and remote signing. So those are things we as an industry have to make sure we're still, managing and going through with our process. On the next slide, I kind of want to share with you how dealers have kind of started to work differently. As they've gone through the process, the first thing they do is directing consumers to websites to look up inventory, check payments, do lease versus retail comparisons, right? They're doing the bureaus like they normally would. They're making sure they get consent from the customers. We've seen an uptake in the amount of out of wallet and red flags that are being triggered because I'm not sitting in front of a customer. Dealers are learning how to negotiate virtually with their customers. It's in talking to dealers as they've gone through this process and hearing from consumers, it's a different playing field now. Being able to sell F&I products when somebody's sitting in F&I manager's office, is a very important tool that the dealers have used in the past, but now dealers have had to learn how to use technologies like FaceTime, GoToMeeting, Teams and things like that to interact with customers. So it's a little bit different for them and they're learning to do it. And then finally, closing and delivery. How are they preparing their packages, documents? I heard from, I didn't hear from directly, but I saw on Squawk Box, AutoNation was saying every car they deliver, they take a brand new pen and put it in a packet so that the customer's never touching that. So, they're all coming up with ways to do remote delivery. They're doing assisted remote signing or remote signing capabilities. I would say that we have to be careful with what's happening emerging in the marketplace from an auto finance perspective. The first thing we have to be careful about is making sure that our dealers are still using compliance solutions for the contracts that are being created. And then we have to really make sure that they're not just having someone electronically sign a document because you want to make sure that's a securitizable document and things like that. And then also we need to make sure that your dealers are delivering vehicles consistent with how the lender agreements that you have. Some of the concerns that our lending partners have come up with, make sure out-of-state deliveries are not being done remotely, make sure there's no fraud, concerns about a customer you haven't seen. So what we're actually doing is asking our dealers and informing our dealers and customers to really make sure that they verify the identity of the customer. So that's how dealers are working remotely. I just want to, reinforce the importance of digital contracting and digital retailing for our audience here. So digital retailing, we actually, a lot of people are familiar with digital retailing, but, it's really emerging. there's leads, there's the ability to structure, and now what's really happening is transacting. And that's really for the ability for the dealer to use 100% of the expectation that the consumers have to actually buy a car online. As it relates to paperless and digital contracting and transacting, let's get to that next page. And for those that know me, I've been talking about digital contracting, e-contracting for a long time. No longer is it if, not even is it when, it is now. Our dealers are demanding and looking for ways to improve their cash flow. Digital contracting emerged as a business continuity opportunity for all of our lending partners to eliminate paper dependencies on resources by making them more process electronic. So digital contracting has emerged almost the same way that we've seen spike in dealer websites. We've seen an incredible spike in dealers enrolling in assisted remote signing capabilities. Something we launched out about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Assisted remote signing enables the dealer to actually transact with the customer in a guided process, have the consumer signing documents. And what's interesting is the dealers have really adapted that assisted remote signing into a couple different flavors. The first flavor is they're actually using assisted remote signing, which is ability for a consumer to use their own device in the showroom. I've talked to a couple dealers. They've actually set up closing stations for their customers. The customer comes in one case it was outside, which must be someplace not in the Northeast because it's been cold still in the Northeast still. The dealer actually sits the customer at a desk. They say, bring your own iPad, or they have an iPad they sterilize, and they launch the signing ceremony and walk them through it, but they're not sitting right across the desk from them. So assisted remote signing has been happening in store, and it's also happening in customers' home and purely online. The other obvious big trend we've seen is remote deliveries have gone up. Dealers taking and delivering the car to a consumer's home. I think it's really important that we make sure, as we're helping our community do that, that we make sure they're consistent with all the rules and regulations, make sure they don't renegotiate the price of the vehicle at the consumer's home, which would basically invoke a 3-day rescission period. But I think it's really important as we go through the digital contracting. It's a necessity for making social distancing, and it's making sure that you as lenders are most efficient and dealers are getting the most cash flow they can possibly get. So as we move on, I kind of want to just go to the next topic, and I think it's really important. We'll bring Jonathan back in a second here, but it's really important as we are now coming out of I would say the bottom and working our way back, is just to make sure that we start thinking about and preparing for the future, as well as what we're talking about now. Just as a recap, consumers want to buy cars online. They want to take deliveries at home. How are we as a lending organization and lending institutions available and supporting that capability? What can we do to continue to deliver automation and efficiency for our dealers? I talked about digital contracting. How do they get payoff quotes? How do they do accelerated titles so they can flip inventory faster? Those are types of things we need to talk about. From a partnership perspective, how are we helping our dealer partners be prepared and supporting them with online deliveries, online applications, and things like that? How are we taking into account as a lending and a financing institution what the consumer's experiences are? And then most importantly, from a risk mitigation perspective, how are we working to make sure that we continue to mitigate the risk of fraud and things that come in to the buying process that get accelerated when you're dealing remotely with people? What best practices can we provide our dealers? We've done a lot of seminars and webinars for dealers on best practices about identity verification, auto wallet, visual contacts and things like that. So I think as we think about those are things us as a lending community need to be thinking about going forward, because I'm optimistic that we will come out of this and we'll be back to full strength, and we need to be prepared to support that new normal. So with that, I'm just going to turn it back to Jonathan to talk about some economics topics. Jonathan?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah. So the topics that we basically wanted to cover are some of the aspects to pay attention to that are going to be kind of ongoing with the market. And as I started talking about the pandemic, market conditions are essentially something that are going to be likely very fluid. We face the potential of having some markets see deteriorating conditions and even having to close down. And so the focus on having the ability to do transactions online will be, certainly more relevant to dealers to assess what they'll be able to do in those kinds of conditions. On the inventory front, let's talk about part of what we're seeing in multiple phases. In the short term, we're oversupplied in the wholesale used market, but actually, believe it or not, inventory levels on used retail lots in the country are now lower than they were pre-pandemic, and that's a key reason why we're starting to see demand pick up at auctions like at Manheim. And so we do think supply is going to continue to be elevated, and we're going to be dealing with waves of additional rental car defleeting and delayed off-lease units hitting the market later in the year. But on the used side, we're going to be oversupplied for the short and medium term, but over the long term, that's going to quickly turn into not enough supply. Certainly, if you've got a time frame looking out at least into next spring, for example. On the new vehicle front, we're already seeing signs that part of the reason why the aggressive incentives are starting to be reduced is that new vehicle supply, particularly for the hottest selling vehicles like pickup trucks, is already starting to be challenged. And with every factory and supplier in the world having been shut down for many weeks, it's likely to be one that the supply chain is going to have a difficult time getting production back up. So we actually believe that new vehicle supply is going to be limited even in the back half of the year, just as the economy starts to improve and start to pick back up. And then as we consider what's happening in credit, we basically are in an environment where we're seeing lenders get more selective. And while we don't have a single indicator to tell you how much tighter the market is, I would say most of the data points outside of what the captive finance lenders are doing would suggest that credit standards are tightening. We've seen banks pull back fairly dramatically in both new and used market. We've seen the spreads on the rates that consumers are getting essentially fatten as the cost of credit has come down, and that's another indicator of lenders perceiving higher risk. And probably the most important factor that we see in credit is that approval rates are definitely down. And when you look at approval rates at a lender level, they're down even more than the approval rates we see for a unique borrower, meaning the dealers and consumers are having to look at more and more lenders in order to find the deal that works. And so as a result, selectively, most lenders are being more selective than they were before. And then finally, looking at lease and fleet, we're in a period where leasing companies, commercial, as well as the captives from leasing to consumers, but also the rental car companies are going to be playing less of a role in the new vehicle market, which means that the OEMs are going to be even more focused on the retail market, needing to kind of fill the gap. But it also means that down the road, once we get through this kind of medium term of seeing more rental units and seeing more off-lease units, we're going to quickly shift to a world that has low supply. And historically, that always happens. When you come out of an economic downturn, when new vehicle sales and production has been limited and down, eventually that means actually the wholesale market has fewer vehicles available. And that's why we feel pretty strongly that vehicle values will recover, especially if you look out more than a year into the future. And so in the short term, it means issues with higher losses and higher severity of losses. But in the long term, it means actually those losses should come down. And those are all factors that you need to keep into consideration, are going to constantly be changing over the next several months. So Andy, are you?
Yeah, so before we get to questions, I just want to leave the team with some thoughts. How are we preparing for the future, right? What are we going to do to prepare for permanent changes in the industry? And these are just questions that I think all of us need to continue to think about and evolve as we go through. How are we going to be positioned to support some of these changes? Will home delivery become the new norm? And with home delivery, what does that mean for us as an industry in terms of, regulations, compliance, and things like that? I know we've spoken about it before in the past, but how could we support a fully automated digital retailing experience, truly paperless? Are our DMVs and states going to allow us to be, in a truly paperless process that will allow, the ability to actually sign everything electronically? And how do we support that? What's it going to take as a community, as a auto finance community, to help our dealer partnerships moving forward? Do we have to make changes in methodologies or the processes we have with them? Some of those things are some things we need to be thinking about. As an industry, we will continue to evolve as an industry. But I think, those are things that we need to be considering, as I do think that we've accelerated the car buying experience, and we've seen that from consumer consent, and we've seen that from the behavior. With that, I'll turn it back to Marcy for some questions that we can go through.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan and Andy. We have a few questions. The first one's for Jonathan. What are your expectations for sales this year?
Well, on the sales side, there's no question we're seeing a pretty tremendous decline. Officially, we believe that new vehicle sales are likely to be down about 30% by the time the year ends. But the low point we think is now behind us. We think April will be the lowest SAR for the year, and we'll see modest recovery as we progress from this point. And similar pattern for used, but down less. Used vehicle sales will probably be down a little bit more than 20%, with retail used sales down closer to 22%. And again, we think the low point was actually the month of April. So we're looking at modest recovery as we get to the year, with used particularly getting stronger, more so than new, because used is not going to be challenged by the supply chain, as I mentioned earlier.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. This one's for Andy. What resources are available to dealerships for digital retail process training?
So we have an entire proactive support organization that is there to support dealers in the product. They used to be, and I say the word, used to be in-store field support. Now they're all online remote field support. But Dealertrack and Cox Automotive invest a lot of in proactive support, and that is to make sure that our dealers can most effectively use our products. In addition, there is consistent amount of training webinars that are provided to the dealers in the community on like best practices, methodologies, and things like that. So if a dealer has a request, they can reach out to the support organization. Some of our dealers reach out to our lenders come back to us, but there's multiple ways for our dealers to get information on how to use the tools most efficiently.
Thank you. Another question is, as dealers begin conducting businesses differently, such as outside the location, and with an increase in shopping, do you feel dealers are ready to adjust and utilize tools to limit fraud?
I do. I think, industry-wide, and not just Dealertrack, there are a number of compliance solutions out there that are in place. Dealers, I think, take the responsibility of compliance very seriously. It has been reinforced. I know that we're reinforcing. I know that NADA did compliance seminars. But basically, the tools to do out-of-wallet, red flag checks, OFAC checks, dealers are still going to need to pull bureaus on customers. They're still going to need to verify their identity. While Dealertrack is not providing legal advice on, exactly, how everything needs to be done, we are providing best practices. For example, we've actually implemented as part of our solution a proof of delivery document, so that if someone delivers a vehicle outside of the dealership, both the consumer and the dealer sign to ensure that the dealer still delivered a paper contract, that they delivered the vehicle on the same day the contract was started, so that the days to first payment and finance is correct. And then the consumer is countersigning that, saying I've gotten the car that was promised to me and all the information. So there are best practices that will help maintain that. We have definitely tried to reinforce to our dealers. Obviously, they need to check with their own legal counsel, but face-to-face, FaceTime, Teams, all those types of things, so people can do video chatting. It's very important, especially when a customer is remote to you.
Thank you. Another question is, indirect lending places the verification of identity on the dealer. Does Dealertrack solution offer an integrated means of doing so? Can you please explain what that specifically looks like and contains?
So there's a couple different things in the Dealertrack solution. As I mentioned, we partner with the bureaus. So if you can get an OFAC or a red flag check on any customer, and we highly recommend that you do that when you actually start a transaction with the customer. We also make sure that the customer is given and gives us proper consent, or the dealer proper consent to do business electronically, as well as to pull their information. I mentioned another product called Out of Wallet. For those that don't know, Out of Wallet is a product where if someone was to steal my wallet, they wouldn't be able to answer the questions that said, Andy, when you lived in Maryland, which one of these addresses, not even when you lived, but which one of these addresses makes sense to you, and the customer has to answer those questions. The dealer wouldn't be able to do. Like I said, so there are technical tools. There's also tools to remind the dealers to make sure they're getting that. And then ultimately, as I mentioned, the visual tools that the dealer should be doing with the customer, verifying, capturing driver's license like they always have for test drives and things like that. So there will continue to be, in our industry, I think there will continue to be more tools that will continue to enhance multi-factor authentication and things like that. So there are a number of tools for that, and it is a dealer's responsibility to maintain and know their customer, just like that customer that walks in the store.
Thank you. Another question is, where do you see the responsibility of identity verification falling when the closing is 100% remote?
Staying away from legal advice, we still believe in an indirect transaction. The dealer who's doing the initial sale and transaction has a responsibility of verifying the ID of the customer and authentication. Obviously the relationship our dealers and lenders have, also have this responsibility to make sure that the lending community is getting the right information from the customer and the dealer. So I want to stay away from the interactions between the dealers and lenders, but we still believe that just like a transaction happens in the store, the same responsibilities for maintaining identity verification and compliance are upheld.
Great, thank you. Another question is assisted remote signing. What versions of Dealertrack's products are needed to allow for this? Unify, or is it possible the older credit card signing pad solution?
Assisted remote signing is available on the Unify platform. And the reason it's not using the credit card signing technology is because the benefit of assisted remote signing is you can actually let a consumer use their own device. So in the assisted remote signing, you can actually pair, Marcy, for example, I could say, once I've verified your ID, I can actually launch our signing room and capabilities into your device, as long as it's a tablet, an iPad, a Samsung Tablet, their own laptop. And basically, I can then launch the signing ceremony onto your device. So that's the benefit of assisted remote signing. The other part about why it's assisted remote signing is because we're only allowing this to happen when a dealer is guiding the customer through, still explaining all the terms and conditions of the agreement. And like I said, best practices, visually identifying who the customer is. But short answer, it's on Unify.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what guidance are dealers getting to mitigate fraud? We see it when people are in person. Online will be much riskier.
I'll go back to what I said a few minutes ago. The industry is all trying to make sure there's best practices out there for our consumers. We talk about our tools, other people talk about their tools to help mitigate that. It's really just, I think, education and ensuring that the dealers reinforce the same processes they would have if someone came into a store. And I think the tools are there, and education is there. We just need to ensure that the dealers continue to do what they do. And we know for a fact that a lot of dealers are actually trying to do, doing what they can for compliance. We know a large percentage of our dealers go through all the compliance steps to authenticate their customer. And we expect that to continue as things are being done remotely. And then the second thing is when they actually deliver the vehicle, to make sure they verify the person's identity and validate who they are before giving them the actual car and things like that.
Thank you. As far as e-contracting, what do you see as major obstacles for lenders to overcome for completion of tips and verifications needed to provide same-day funding?
That's a great question. I think the first barrier is the inability to get everything electronically. There's still some documents out there that have to be physically signed, and that eliminates a fully paperless process from a signing experience. But as far as other barriers, I really don't. I think that the e-contracting, digital contracting, is mature enough for, from a technology perspective, and all the LOS systems and all of our lending partners have some of the best, the right tools in place to facilitate it. I say still the biggest challenge is making sure that we get rid of the need to have physically signed documents. I also don't want to discount the importance of making sure that the contracts are signed in a way that protects the lenders to get a document, an authoritative version that can be securitized. I think it's really important for our lenders to make sure they understand that, and that our dealers live up to that obligation.
Thank you. Another question is, what data sources are used by the Add-a-Wallet tool?
The Add-a-Wallet tools are typically provided by our bureau partners, and they use their own information. They use bureau-related data, and they use other information. You have to defer to the bureaus on the actual tools and data sources that they use to create that. But those are products that they derive from the data that's in their bureau databases.
Thank you. Another question is, how much do you feel went up demand since mid-March will account for the increase in auto sales over the next couple months? Do you have an approximate percentage estimate?
Percentage, Marcy, would you repeat what the percentage estimate was related to what level?
Yeah, how much do you feel went up? Yeah, mid-March.
Okay.
Since mid-March.
So basically, we need to talk both new and used. On the new side, I actually think the issue is going to become more supply. And so I don't anticipate we're going to hit that I think we were at 16, more than a 16 million SAR in February, for example. And so I would actually think the new vehicle market remains under 13 at probably its best level towards the end of the year. December is usually a strong month, so 13 would be a really good number given the challenges we think the new vehicle market will face on the supply side. On the used side, I think we have the potential of actually seeing a lot of pent-up demand that would have normally been buying in the spring. If you think about the used vehicle market, March, April, and May are typically the largest months of the year by far compared to the rest of the year. So we've still got that demand more supply coming from rental companies and from off-lease units that were extended, we're basically going to need to see the market transact those vehicles. So normally volumes actually pick up. So I'm much more bullish on that from a used perspective than from a new perspective.
Thank you. What is one big technological enhancement not in place yet? Do you think that will help dealers not just survive, but thrive in the next 2 years?
I think ultimately, you know, the ability for a customer to buy a car completely online. And when I say completely online, that means the ability for them to find a car, then to negotiate with their customers and structure a deal, dealers to maximize profitability, make sure we authenticate and, you know, reduce the fraud risk that we talked about earlier. I just kind of think it's a matter of, you know, there's always been that opportunity or goal to have somebody sell a car like you buy a product. I'm sure all of us in the last 6 to 8 weeks have bought a lot more stuff online. And I think some of the technologies are, you know, providing the capabilities that facilitate that. And those technologies range not only from a dealer or consumer facing, but even our lending partners as well. You know, the ability for a lender to communicate a singular decision response that could allow someone to structure a deal. It's called alternative deal structuring in the industry a little bit, so that you don't have to go back and rehash decisions all the time. The ability for, you know, a consumer to actually do everything paperless. I think it's really turning the retailing process into in a true one-click solution. And I know it's not a one-click, but giving that opportunity for a truly online experience, I think is where our technology needs to evolve to as an industry. And that's in every component of it, from lead to contract.
Thank you. Do you think that leasing will have a significant portion of auto sales for the remainder of the year?
Actually, I'm not super optimistic on that front for 2 reasons. One, the decline in wholesale values that we've seen in the short term is leading lenders and residual forecasting companies to be much more conservative, which essentially means it requires a substantial amount of lease subvention to make that attractive to the consumer in a payment. And instead, we're seeing manufacturers lean towards just straight financing offers and cash on the hood. So I think actually leasing is likely to be weaker than we have been seeing over the last several years until we start to see values stabilize more.
Thank you. Do you believe the backup of repossessions will lower the valuation of vehicles?
So typically when you have pressure from repossessions, it's because the volumes are overwhelming demand. And actually repossessions are down thus far, and we think the payment forbearances and moratorium on repossessions are likely to keep repossession volumes limited for the next several months. I think more of the pressure is going to come later in the year from delayed off-lease units or units that would have been maturing in March, April, and May that have been extended, and also the rental vehicles that I mentioned earlier.
Great, thank you so much. Looks like we have one more question. Do you believe, looks like, yeah, we answered pretty much everything. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Andy, for sharing your expertise with us. Remember, the slides and recording of today's webinar will be available on AFSA's website under the Webinar Resource Center. Thank you so much, everyone. This concludes today's presentation.